Right, we're live. I have literally no idea whether anyone's watching because my stream setup's all different for this. So this is an experimental stream, which is always very cool. Where to start? I got asked repeatedly, actually, lately, and understandably, whether I was ever going to do any commentary or videos on the Soviets, because they are in a rough place right now, to put it bluntly, in cards. And whilst we've got some downtime, as of right now, I've got at least 30 minutes before my server is back up for me to actually be able to play the game. I figured I'd raise people's conversations about whether I do video and actually do something I've never done before, which is live stream brainstorming my thoughts. So that's what this is going to be. I'm here. I will have one eye on chat. I will be going through, from my point of view, the process that I would go through if someone at 1939 said, "Come take a look at the design of this nation in our game. Break it down and tell us what directions you think would be interesting to explore." This might be interesting to some people. This might not. I have no idea. I don't know whether anyone's going to watch this. I don't know whether anyone's going to sit and watch this back, because I will almost certainly put this up on YouTube, because I think it's an interesting thought process. So why am I in any way remotely qualified to do this is probably one good question. And that question can be answered by the fact that I've done it for other things. So I have done some design work for tabletop RPGs and bits like that, and I've been playing card games for 30 plus years. I've even toyed with some people's ideas in the background about design and given some thoughts on their own card game design. Never something I hugely got into because it was just not what caught my attention at the time. But I have a pretty good understanding of how to break down a card, and what the general design behind it is. So I suppose there's some value in seeing what my thoughts might be, at least for some people. They ask me, so I'm going to throw them out there. So first of all, if you're out there in chat, please throw me a hi so that I know I'm not talking into the ether. And chill out, relax, and we'll do things. I'm going to go about this the way that I normally would, which is by actually looking at things. So the first thing we're going to do is go and look at Soviets via the collection on the Cards website, because I can't access my client right now. I am a tad disappointed, although it is understandable, that the website has not been updated with the latest patch changes yet, so that's something we have to keep in mind as well, because obviously there were 2 changes to Soviet cards in the latest balance patch. You can go see my views on that. So I'm just doing this whole thing with a web tab because it's just easier, because it means I can hop you between the Cards website and being able to take a look at the collection, and also be able to look at the actual card pool, because being the human being that I am, when we got covert operations, the first thing I did was get an account to level 12 so I could break down the card pool that would be available to a completely new player. This is relevant for me because, I mean, let's start from the beginning. How do you assess the value of a nation? How do you design something like a faction in a card game? Usually the answer is by having a theme or themes in mind that fit a set of mechanics and balances that you normally follow. So, things that generally exist in card games. Most card games function off some form or forms of units of value, which is to say that there is a somewhere in 1939's, I would imagine, design documentation, there is a matrix of effectively values and what they fit at and how they equate to the valuation and weighting of a card. In cards, this is, like in most collectible games, also adjusted by the weighting of rarity. So we deal with standard cards, limited cards, special cards, and elite cards. I was about to say rare cards, and it's about the same thing. So you're doing about distribution and how many of them you can actually include in a deck, thus also weights at what value you have on it. Obviously, the other thing that is relevant here is that you can have an ally in cards, so you can run up to 12 cards from another nation, which is likely to have an impact because it allows you to use anything that's not an elite from that nation. Right, so the basic thing that I'm generally looking for then is what constitutes a fairly standard expectation. Now that's difficult to answer because in cards we have a huge number of variables. Unlike many card games where the general balance is going to be the stats on the card plus its resource cost, in cards we also have an operation cost, because we need operation costs both to activate the card but also to move it forward if it needs to move forward into the front line, which is another point of variation. We obviously have some cards which have reach, in effect. I suppose you would consider them ranged cards in the form of bombers and artillery and fighters, which can attack directly from the support line. All this is by way of saying that this is going to be far from a perfect swing at this, because cards is complicated, and without access to the core design documentation, I'm going on my natural instincts, which are probably okay, but not perfect. I'm almost certainly going to get some things wrong and make mistakes. And also, it's an evolved pool. It's been around for a while, so there's going to be some changes, and nations have themes. Anyway, one of the first things I did when people asked me, alright, so what would I do to fix? And that has been the specific commentary, has been fixing Soviets. So right now, Soviets are in a pretty awful place from the point of view of actually played decks in the meta. There aren't any. Realistically, there are no like top end Soviet decks seeing regular play, and you have to ask yourself why. And that is, I think, slow is a word that I want to use, but I also want to use clunky. So the more I dug into this, and I've spent a little bit of time just kind of looking through the pool myself and thinking about how I feel about it, there isn't the smoothness in Soviet decks. Now, what do I mean by this? I'm going to illustrate it by talking about the starting cards in covert operations. So, I have up in front of me, on a different screen, which you presently can't see, the starter decks for the Soviet Union, which is to say the starter deck that you're given at the start of the game and the deck that you get at level 12, which gives you this, which is the Soviet card pool. Ignore the US and Japan one. These are all of the card pools that are available when you get your nations to level 12. Why is this relevant? Because this is the foundation for any new player, and the new player has to be the place we start with this. If we start into this process from the perspective of a player who's been playing cards for a long time and has a complete collection, we're going to have a problem, because they are going to have very different perspectives on the meta and what's good and what isn't, and what's worth playing and what isn't, because they have access to much better cards. Demonstrably better cards, in point of fact. So, what do I mean by the lack of streamlining? So if you look at the starting pool for any of the other nations, what's interesting is that you see a direction of travel, at least one, often more than one, that kind of makes sense from the card pool. The Japan base units that are available give you some air units, but do primarily point you in the direction of quite aggressive, fast-moving infantry and tank strategy, which leads naturally to Japan aggro. This is relevant because this is what happened when I redid my starter decks for covert operations. There is a reason that Soviets were the last nation that I was able to do this for, and that I was it was a longer and more complex video that I did on Soviet starter decks, and the reason for that is that the Soviet starter pool doesn't actually give a hyper-consistent direction of travel. You don't look at it. Like previously, you looked at the Soviet starter pool and it just screamed tokens. It said light infantry spam, and buffing and support was what your card pool was opening up to you, and that was relatively easy to follow. In the same way that Japan pointed into in Japan aggro, US has always perennially pointed in the direction of general mid-range. Germany has edged towards tanks and specifically combined arms, and Brits have tended to be very air focused, depending on how good that happens to be at the time, whether that be kind of ramping into big bombers, or as it is now, a more classical kind of Brit air with a faster process. So cool, when I looked at these, I didn't struggle to see the direction that the cards were taking me. When I looked at the Soviets, I really did, because it's a very inconsistent pool of cards. You don't look at it and go, it's focused on anything specific. There's a chunk of artillery, but artillery's never been in and of itself a particularly strong direction to go. There's some air, particularly some big heavy bombers, and as is classic for Soviets, you do get some decent orders. You get 3 copies of Bloody Sickle, a copy of Burning Sky, and a couple of copies of the Hammer, which means you do start with decent removal, but there's nothing in the pool that massively supports a specific archetype. It sort of looks like, by the time you look at the name and the necessary bits that go with the level 12 deck, there's a certain degree of conversation about the idea of self-damage for gaining benefit is in there, and there are a few units in there that do that, but nothing weighty enough for me to think, yeah, this is definitely going in that direction, and we're definitely seeing that specific thing. So, for example, if we hop over to the collection, things that we start with. So I've pulled this down to just units. I'm not concentrating on orders at the minute. We have a couple of copies of the 37 mil anti-tank, anti-aircraft gun, which is this job here in the level 12 Soviet deck. It's Soviet Poland, by the way, which also is interesting. This is a 1/1 1 cost, 1 op cost, totally vanilla, smoke-screened artillery that causes enemy air units to operate at too high a cost. It can be annoying if you're playing air into it, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not. This doesn't light fires. You're not looking at this going, right, absolutely, I understand, this is going to be good. Then we get Bloody Sickle and Winter Warfare. Let me just open up. As I say, I had not opened up the orders on here, but we will. So we also get, as we scroll down by cost, we get access to Bloody Sickle, which of course is 1 damage for 1 cost and draw a card, which is a great card and remains so. We see Winter Warfare, which is also included in this deck. Which is deal 1 damage to all, so if you're going self-damage, yes, I can see that. There are 3 copies of the 2nd Marines Battalion. Now, 2nd Marines is interesting because this is a weird unit. Interestingly, when I first saw this unit, I saw a concept that was, to me, there is a clear concept behind this unit. It's not very good. I'm not going to say it's very good. So this is a 2 cost, 0 op cost, 2/4 infantry with blitz that has a drawback in the sense that it says combat damage dealt to this unit is doubled. Now, this is interesting because this is an early unit that is very difficult to remove with orders. Because orders, you can't pop this with, like, if you get a board full of these and fire desperate measures onto it, they don't die because it's not combat damage. So I think the idea behind this unit was to create a unit that was relatively order resistant, but was gonna not perform much above its par in combat, because in effect this unit is a 2/2 when it comes to good old fashioned straightforward combat. So it's a 2 cost 0 op cost 2/2 with blitz, which is still a decent body. It's a little overcosted, but then you've also got the advantage of it. So this was an interesting card to me when I looked into it. And certainly it's a card that you're going to have to make use of if you're going to take this starter deck anywhere. Then we've got 3 copies of the 456th, which is the Rifle Regiment. Now this obviously is a self-damage tool. So this is pretty common in self-damage decks and makes sense. It's 2 cost, 1 op cost, 1/3 infantry. It gets +1/+1 in guard when your HQ takes damage, which of course stacks. So if your HQ continues to take damage, it can't gain guard again, but it can keep getting +1/+1. So it can snowball at least a little bit. But can it actually snowball enough? On its own, generally no. But it's a decent self-damage tool, and we do get 3 of them. So okay, we are seeing some of the self-damage stuff kind of trying to show itself here. So then we go to the 845th. This is the other side of self-damage. So this is every time this unit is dealt damage, your HQ gains an equal amount of defense. So the more this gets hit, your HQ gets defense back. It's 2 cost, 2/3 with 1 op cost. It's very vanilla infantry. So you're kind of getting it. You see that we are going in that direction. You get Heroes of the Soviet Union, which I'm not going to go into in any great detail, because they included all of the same card. So every nation now gets, at level 12, access to their 2 cost, pick 1 of 3 elite units from your nation to add to your hand. And I don't know. I see why. They're an interesting way of giving players access, new players access to the pool of elite cards, so that they can play around and try with different things and see what works. But in the end, these are generally considered to be mostly lackluster cards. The Germany one sees more play, actually, than some of the others, because there are some incredibly good German pickups. But, on the whole, it's generally accepted to be... Hey, Neil! Generally accepted to be a little bit lackluster. So this is, standard stuff, I guess. So what else do we get in here? We get 2 copies of Katyusha. Now Katy's great. We love Katy. I love Katy. I think Katy's a great card. But this is not a self-damage card. This is not. This is just a really good blitz artillery. So it's not really doing anything for what they're claiming the main archetype here is. It's just giving you a piece of artillery that you can use, which is fine. It's a good card. The next thing that we get is the T-70. Note, also, not really... There's nothing self-damage about this. This is just a honestly pretty indifferent tank. It's 2 cost, 1 op cost, 3/2 tank with guard. I'm not really sure. There's not a lot to say about it because it's incredibly vanilla at best. We do get 4th Cuban Cossacks as the elite. Is that a good thing? I mean, it's an elite unit. It's very quick, but it's not lighting the world on fire in comparison to anything else. I mean, 3 cost, 0 op cost, 3/3 with blitz and smokescreen. By the way, weirdest combination of keywords ever. If it had operation cost, then I could see why you would bother giving it smokescreen. But given that it's 0 op cost, you play it, you can move it, it has blitz, so unless you're planning to find some way of buffing it. But anyway, it's not like this card sees a lot of play. I'm not going to break down the design too much, because it's not. We're here to talk about where we go with this, and I promise there is a reason that I am wittering on about the starter deck, because yeah, I mean, Ambush would certainly have helped. The foundations of any nation in this game are going to be the experience you get when you first start playing it. And the point I'm illustrating here is that the Soviet deck talks about self-damage whilst having a Polish ally, and having virtually no good self-damage tools. Which leads me on to the 76mm howitzer. It's an interesting piece of artillery, this, because it does have smokescreen, which means you can put it down and you can probably get some use out of it. Unless your opponent wants to fire off an order to remove it, you can get 3 points of damage out of it. But honestly, you only get 1 copy of this, and this is not gonna help a deck that is attempting to leverage self-damage. This is, for me, this is a very specific tool. You would need to be contesting the front line heavily enough to keep your artillery alive, or controlling the board enough to keep your artillery alive for this to be a relevant card. We get, how many copies? We get 2 copies of From the People. 2 cost, deal 3 damage to a unit. This is on par, as I say. You get your bloody sickles. You have From the People. You're getting removal in Soviets. You just are. Yeah, I mean, that would be. What's interesting about the Soviet starter deck in general is that it doesn't. The point I'm making, as I kind of blitz through the last few parts of this, is from a design perspective. If you said to me, come along, as I say, hey Ahmed, as I say, if this, I'm approaching this from the point of view of if 1939 literally said to me, take a look at the Soviet nation, break it down, give us your views on where it is and what direction of travel you think is interesting design space. I'm literally, if I was contracted as a designer, I am going through, live on stream with you guys, the process that I would go through, which is to look at the experience of the nation from the beginning. We get the Su-76, wherever I've hidden it, which does get us back into the self-damage a little bit, because now we've got something that actually does deal damage to your HQ. How I would love to actually, see this get adjusted a bit to have blitz in some way. This doesn't. It's not impactful enough on its own. We do get 3 of them, so obviously they are relevant. Then we get Critical Hit, which is a beautiful piece of art for a frankly very expensive and thus only nichely useful order. I'm not saying this order can't occasionally do some serious work, but it's not gonna light the world on fire. And then we start to get into the world of weirdness, because we get the IL-2M, wherever it's gone. Is it not listed in Soviets? It's a Soviet card. Never mind. Anyway, it's the fighter. We'll dig it out in a bit. It's not actually super relevant to this. We also get the Sturmovik. Hey, Von Squirty. Which is a big heavy bomber, dealing excess damage to the enemy HQ. Again, this isn't going anywhere in the direction of anything that's clearly telling me anything. Then we're on to the T-34-76. Alright, so now we're into the T-34s. Now, that's fine. Except that's not shifting us again in the direction that we want to be going. The Yak 9, we get both Yak 9s. And then we get the 74th Silesian and the 35th Infantry Regiment from the Soviets. I'm not going to belabor the point, because the aim here was to look at the level 12 deck, which is generally considered to be like, this is the thing that is put in front of you at the end of your starter experience, and you get your nation to level 12, and this is what you're handed as a deck to work with. And this thing doesn't actually holistically do anything. It's very mixed, kind of mixed bag, with a few tiny bits of self-damage in it. No, you don't. So I've been going over the cards. The actual list is... And to see through my drive very rapidly, New Player 2.0. Let me throw up the list for anyone who's interested. Post-covert ops, basic decks. Hey, Super 5 Gamer, I shall get to that in a moment. Germany, Japan. Have I gone past this? USA. I'm scrolling too quickly for my own good. Yes, here we go. So this is the Soviet level 12 deck, which you can have a look at while I'm addressing it. Super 5 Gamer. No, the intent won't be to make Soviets into an allied nation, because mechanically to do that you'd actually need to remove them from the game, rework the entire card pool, and then put them back in again, because allied nations can't run elites, and that's the allied nations don't obey the same mathematical balancing rules as do main nations. Hey Ketchup, it's an interesting, like, honestly I'm not sure what the suggested direction of travel is. My feeling is that the things that have been pushed are self-damage, especially with the new tank, what's the SU-100, and some of the changes, and a couple of the cards that are included in the starter deck. But self-damage is not actually that good, plus they rotated out one of self-damage's best tricks, which was being able to pop a really good KV2, which you can't do anymore. By pop a KV2, I mean use stand together to destroy a 6-cost infantry and get it back. I did wonder for a minute, Cola. I know, I've got you. It's, of the starter decks, it's by far the weakest. I mean, the starter decks are not world-breaking, but this one's just not unified. And that's it doesn't have a strong spine, which is something that designers will talk about endlessly, and I certainly will endlessly, which is the idea that there should be a central feel to the thing that you're doing. The same, of course, should be true of your faction. So if you're talking about faction design in card games, we'll pop back to the collections. The view in here is really difficult, because part of what you're looking for is a kind of central point, a feeling of it. So the first place that I would normally look for this is the 0 for 1 cost card. This is usually the card that in these nations will point you in the general direction that the designers have in mind. In the case of the Soviets, that's this. So, yeah, one of the hardest parts with Soviets is that they have a lot of individually good cards, but there's no central deck that just makes sense to me anyway. So the 329th Engineer Battalion. This is a relevant card because the this suite of cards, these main nation cards, with the exception of the Jasko, because it's just become a different thing, generally point you in the direction of travel that the designers clearly had in mind. 329th is all about benefiting your nation when you lose units, and that's a very Soviet concept. That when you consider light infantry spam. Hey Sabretooth, welcome aboard. Yeah, so light infantry spam was a big part of that. Was the idea that disposable could be something that you could focus on with Soviets. The changes to tokens were significant. Not crippling, in that tokens is still playable. I've still seen a couple of them around, and you could certainly play it in the lower ranks to climb for a bit. But lack of no surrender, and then the adjustment to Baranovici, genuinely just took away a lot of what was driving tokens. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds too much on the whys and wherefores, but clearly there was an intentionality to those changes. I did, and it's so you are correct. Yeah, I used only standard and limited cards to field marshal on tokens. The big issue was removing no surrender. Yeah, no surrender was a huge tempo tool. While you can kind of approximate it with the other blitz order and a unit in hand, it's just not got the same impact as no surrender. It's close, but it also means, yeah, deep operation, which is, it's close, but it limits the number of times you can actually do it, because previously, of course, you had your deep operations and your no surrenders, which meant you could use the same trick multiple times, which if you actually go back and watch me playing the deck, I do on a regular basis. And so there are a lot of questions. So Sabretooth asks a really relevant question, and I'm going to address it with speculation, and I'm going to be very clear that it's speculation. It's educated speculation, because I live in design space, and I know what business is like. When no surrender went, what I expected to happen was not what did. So when no surrender went, one of the questions that was asked quite regularly was why. Now, when you break it down as a designer, there are usually, there's only one, right? Usually you would only do something like this if a deck is on the cusp of becoming just too good. And tokens, frankly, wasn't. It was decent. It was finally working its way from tier 2 to maybe the bottom end of actually playable tier 1. But that wasn't, for me, there was no way that was the intention behind it. What I do think might be a factor is that the issue with tokens is that tokens is incredibly crafting light. As noted earlier, I have proven that you can field marshal a tokens deck without a single elite or special card. Now, in a collectible card game, which is driven by people wanting to collect rarer cards for greater power, historically, decks, white weenies in Magic was a good example, that became really good while cheap tended to hit a nerve because they were not encouraging people to buy into the product. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the pure value with 1939, because 1939 have a very proven track record of not being that profit hungry, because the game is still very playable, free to play. But what I expected when I saw the removal of No Surrender that then didn't happen was the release of maybe an elite and a special, or maybe a couple of specials that were token support, that would lift tokens, but also bring tokens the need, if that makes sense, to actually have to have elite and special cards in it, thus making it slightly more what a designer like myself would call aspirational, thus incentivizing collection, as opposed to an unbelievably utilitarian deck. Depths of Winter, I think, was possibly an attempt to do something similar, but Depths of Winter was not actually particularly good. Hey, Chaotic. The thing is, Depths of Winter wasn't a particularly good tokens card. A, Ketchpap is correct, it came in Winter War, and B, it wasn't the best card for tokens most of the time. It was a much more effective card in Soviet control decks, or slow burn decks, or combo Ketchupap on the point. In tokens, it doesn't do anything useful because you're already generating tokens, and you don't want to turn your tokens into tokens and then your opponent's tokens into tokens, because the best you get out of that deal is that you can buff them and your opponent can't. And honestly, that's not... it doesn't drive the deck. It's like, I didn't run it in tokens at all, or recommend it in my elite and specials, including full-blown tokens guides. Not that I've recommended any elites, really, because tokens didn't need them, which goes back to my original point. But the point is that yeah, I mean, agreed, tokens do not have the versatility in the current meta, even with the weeping, even with the weakening of it, tokens is still not... It would need more support. I was genuinely surprised that we didn't see some special and elite support for tokens as an archetype. Then when we saw the SU-100, I thought we were going to see... when I saw that combined with the inclusion of a lot of self-damage tools in the starting Soviet pool, or at least a reasonable number of them, I wondered, were we going to start seeing self-damage become something that was going to be pushed? Then obviously there's the elephant over there in the form of covert, which is the other big Soviet mechanic, which, if you've watched my Tuesday streams, you'll have seen me play around with. So these are mechanics that are out there. But the question is, so the question I got asked, and kind of the point of this stream is, as a designer, what would I want to do, or what would I suggest doing? Color, I agree. I think it's a better card than people think it is, but I also think that the weakness of Soviets in general right now has been such that I don't think people have been experimenting enough to get to it. I personally want to play around with it a bit. I think it's got potential. It's certainly got some punch. We should probably actually go and look at it while I'm talking about it, because no, we want Soviet tanks, because then I have less scrolling to do. There we are, the SU-100. So, gotcha. Um, Thanks, Collar. So this made me think that we were going to go in the direction of self-damage becoming a stronger archetype. And I think that was interesting to me. But then there wasn't enough else that was there. And so if there's nothing to really support it heavily, like there's nothing in self-damage right now that unifies it. Like the old self-damage logic used to be you'd play around for ages and ages until you got out a very, very cheap, expensive infantry regiment, which you would then obliterate with stand together to get a blitzing tank. But that was more of a combo deck than actually what I always envisaged the core of self-damage. If you look at something like the SU-100, this is an aggressive value card. So from a design perspective, this card punches way above its weight, as long as you can find a way to put some damage on it. And that's kind of not a bad direction to head in. Yeah, I was expecting something to come in to replace it when it rotated out, but it didn't. So now there is no 7k tank. You can still, you can pull off a 6k tank with different things, but there are things you can definitely do with the various self-damage tools. Where's the other self-damage tank? So T-35 obviously has just been changed. There we are, the SU-76M. So the SU-76M, this is again, this looks like a really good base tool for self-damage because you're getting deployment. But again, I would love to have seen this have blitz and maybe adjusted stats because of it, because it's so slow. And if you're going to go in that direction, that becomes an issue. Now, one of the things that... Yeah, I agree with that as well, Sabertooth. I think so. One of the reasons that I did not, in my Soviet starter guide, go down the direction of self-damage is that I don't think it's a great starter deck. I don't think it's a great deck, but direction to travel in for new players, because you really do need to be happy on the knife edge. I love it. I think it's very fun to play around with. Whenever I've played around with it, I've had a blast, even if it's not very good, because I feel like I'm having to manage things. I think it's close. I think it's... whether it is quite as high as SKD, it's less maths heavy, but slightly more awareness heavy, I would say. But yeah, in the end, one of the key things with self-damage is that you are treating your HQ defense as a resource, which in a game where there are orders and units that can directly target HQ is incredibly dangerous, thus meaning that you have to become very proficient to be good on it. Similar again to self-credit denial. You have to have the skill to actually play the deck well. What the Soviets, for me, need is a central deck that fits the same niche that do the other decks that you see for the other nations. So if we look at... Yeah, Push needs a rework. Push really needs a rework. As much as it's a card you can use, and I have used before, it doesn't feel right in the game that we're playing to me. But that's just me. But pushing self-damage at the minute is just... it doesn't work the way you want it. So yeah, so Ketchupat brings up Sauveur. Sauveur is, if you look at my guide to new players for Soviets, the direction that I largely suggest is probably the best one to head in, because you can build a decent Soviet air deck, but the problem is it's decent, it's not as good as Britair. It's not really on the same thing, and when you look at the selection of aircraft, you start to understand why. And the first reason is this. This is the only Soviet one-drop aircraft. Now, that's a problem, because, as illustrated by Britair, one of the things you want in an air deck is to be able to get early board presence, because otherwise you have to find a way to keep people away long enough to actually bring something into play. So for me, if I was going in that direction, and if I was going to go in the direction of Soviet Air, I would like to see some one-cost Soviet aircraft. Possibly with some interesting downsides, because once you go a bit further up, you start to get cards that are not actually terrible. There are some decent late Soviet cards in air. We all know that the Petlyakov is really quite good. We also all know that you can get some good Yak draw. And of course, the Sturmovik, I think, is a very strong card used well. And even more so if you can combine it with something that buffs heavy armor. But again, heavy armor's not something that's seen a lot of buff either. It's another possibility to consider for Soviets, is whether you want to focus on really, really resilient armor and tanks. But I think the direction of travel that I personally would like to see would be a bit more mid-range, a bit more not generic but value-centric. So there is a card, and I was talking about this earlier in the stream, and I'll talk about it again, because when I saw this card, I saw an idea. Now, this is not a good card. Before chat explodes at me, I'm not going to argue that this is an incredibly good card. But this showed me that there was, at some point, developer thought around the idea of Soviets having an advantage against order and non-combat damage. Because that is the only redeeming feature, beyond the fact that it has Blitz, of the 2nd Marines Battalion, is the fact that it takes double damage from combat, but not from orders. So this is actually quite hard to remove with orders. This, to me, is interesting design space. This could be interesting to dig into, because if you combine this with the change to the Soviet infantry, whose name, 60th Cavalry, you see an anti-order feel. That's a design space that we've not, making orders and countermeasures ineffective. And there are some other bits floating around. There is the bomber, the Catalina, that gets bonuses when countermeasures trigger. There are little tiny bits in the Soviet pool that point in that direction, and to me, that when I looked at this, that was interesting design space. And I liked the idea of going that. Soviet hyper aggro, powered by a specific mechanic. Ketchup. I'm always interested to hear the direction. Going aggro for Soviets would be an interesting direction to go in. I always thought it felt like that's where self-damage kind of wanted to go at least with some of the initial units, the idea that these units have a really, really fast impact. But honestly, the self-damage units mostly are value units now, and the question, like, Soviets don't have a lot of really good aggro tools. Yeah, cheap units with drawbacks, which is one of the things, again, one of the things I like about Second Marines, is precisely that. This feels very Soviet. It feels like the theme here is the body is good, but it comes with a substantial drawback. It has 0 op cost, which we've all learned is an important thing. It would be interesting to be able to do stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, something like if you play orders deal damage to it on a big unit, or a unit that takes substantially more. You could go the opposite direction to the Second Marine. So the Second Marines obviously takes double damage from combat. You could have a unit that takes double damage from orders. You could give units weaknesses. There are directions that you could go in with that would be interesting. To give them basically heavier bodies, but with a drawback. And to put them in a position of doing it. Yeah, I mean, that is a direction that would be interesting to see them go, and particularly with, as I say, the 60th Cavalry change, which is definitely not a fan of orders. War production, yep, you are correct, goes or went in that same direction of being a card that actually positively encouraged you not to have orders in your deck. The more risk you take in putting orders in your deck, the more chance of losing them. That, for me, is interesting design space. That's design space that could give the Soviets a value engine. I mean, Soviet / anything. So the one thing I will say is, from a designer's point of view, when looking at this, I only see Soviet / blank. I have no interest in ally nations, because that, having an ally nation focused in your head will skew your design. Because what I'm looking for, from a design perspective, if this is of interest to anybody, then this is the way my brain approaches this, is I want to build a spine. Preferably more than one, but at least one spine in the nation. Which then means that I want that to be the nation, not the nation plus another nation to make it good. Because that is, for me, the problem with Soviet Air at the moment, is that kind of Soviet Air is hyper-dependent on having Britain as an ally, because really you just want to take advantage of all of the Brit Air cards that are really good. Color, yeah, and from a designer's perspective, mono decks are where you should always start. You should be looking at internal synergy over expected external synergy. Of course, in the case of cards, there is ally nations, which has exactly the opposite effect. Yeah, destruction's another thing that would feel quite Soviet. Anything that... So, again, to go back to the designer's own kind of... These have always been the kind of the flags that are planted in the ground, as far as I can tell, of the design of the nations. These are the big things that want to say, hey, this is what we want the nation to be about. This card tells me that we should have Soviet cards and Soviet support that helps you if your units are dying. When a unit is destroyed, X happens. A unit on the board that gains buffs for units that are destroyed. So obviously we have something similar in that you can get units that reduce their cost for the number of units you have. Instruction deck for Soviets for so Soviet lack auto include cards. I agree. You don't. I don't. The minute I look at the Soviet pool, I'm not thinking, well, this, and this are cards that there's no for freedom in the Soviet pool. I mean, I think the closest you get is Bloody Sickle. I think Bloody Sickle is close to an auto include because it is just value. Is pretty good. I also do like clear the filters down again. There are other things that would like to see more of, like Claim the Skies. This when it first landed, I was like, oh, there are so many interesting directions you can go with this, because this has the potential to make heavy air. Yeah, if you can send them to me, I'd be very appreciative. Like, this makes heavy air interesting. Because the advantage of this is that heavy air gets heavier and gets a free attack. So you get to attack twice with a heavy aircraft every turn. The downside, of course, is that it takes reciprocal damage if it's a bomber, which it normally wouldn't. I'm fine with that. That's a downside. But +1/+3 is interesting. Only Soviet units, maybe. Certainly it would be interesting if it only affected Soviet units. Similarly to Blood Red Skies, I agree. Give some punch to Soviet air decks. Ambush decks, like I agree. So ambush is an interesting mechanic, and it came back again when we got the all of the new 3-cost stuff. Oh, here's another card that I wanted to see this mean more when it landed. And you can tell this from my previous Tuesday streams where I've been playing around with ambush. With covert, rather. I really wanted Field Recon to be more impactful, because this feels like the kind of order that should be. Yep, I agree. Blood Red Sky. The big drawback of Soviet air is that you don't have anything early to put on the board. And yeah, Covert's issue is that it doesn't have any acceleration. And most of what your Covert deck wants to do is very easily popped by they're hyper vulnerable to artillery and bombers, which is a thing. And bombers are more of an issue than artillery. Artillery is not the strongest thing in the world. There are some interesting artillery decks out there, but they're not great. And yeah, we don't have a one-drop. We literally have one-drop bomber, and it's not great. 16. I mean, that's not an impossible sell. You probably need to adjust its stats a little. You might want to drop it to I think it would need. Would I do it as a 2/2? I mean, we've got 1/3. 2/1 is probably closer. Yeah, 2/1 is probably closer to where I'd put it. You'd lose a point of defense, but yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, Covert needs time. One of the things that I did talk to someone about on Discord was that someone was mentioning that they were talking about ways to accelerate Covert timers. And I mentioned that actually in my own little handwritten theory notes, I had noted that if ever there was going to be a Soviet research card, once I saw the new covert units, I think it would have been interesting if it had a timer accelerator as an option in there. Like, your cards that run on timers gain a turn. Yep, agreed. The lack of pop-off. What, 1k, 1 op, 1-1 gives you a 2-2 in hand? Probably be a limited rather than a standard, at least, I would have thought. But, I mean, honestly, something similar to that as a special that gives you a really good card in hand would also be interesting. Since we seem to be heading down that valley direction. But, yeah, I mean, the point is that Soviet Air is a design space that would be interesting to head into. And it's... yeah, I mean, random is always interesting. I mean, hell, you could just... I mean, we're there already. Why not just have it destruction, develop a Soviet air unit? Or develop a Soviet fighter, or something similar. Yes, it possibly would, Collar, but... again, I think... obviously the focus of this is that I'm just brainstorming the direction that I would go, and if someone said to do something with Soviets, my instinct is to lean back to heavy infantry with support from functional tanks. But I mean, my point being, if we are going to go into that like develop, you might as well use the develop mechanic for what it's intended to. Ground focus is obviously the natural place to expect to go with Soviets, and if we're going in the direction of ground focus, so let's just look at Soviet infantry. So, one drop infantry, obviously, we have quite a chunk of it. I quite like the idea of focusing in on artillery a bit as support for infantry. Because infantry supported by artillery would be a very interesting direction to go in. We've already got Catty, which is a really good blitz artillery piece. I like that. Some more artillery design space to give good support to infantry. Not a bad choice. So 173rd Guards. This is a card that I looked at, and I really wanted to find something to like about this card, because the idea behind it, the idea of a one-drop infantry that can benefit from self-damage, if you're going in the self-damage direction, is really interesting to me. But at the very least, this would need a point of defense. Or, yeah, you could do it that way. Every time your HQ takes damage, it sticks around longer. That'd be interesting. Yeah, like being able to deal damage to the HQ. Hey, BVG. There are some really good pieces that you could use. So some more support to bring like again, this would feed into this card, and I'm going to go straight back to this, and I'm going to go back to this on a regular basis, because I'd like to see this, if it were me, again, the whole hypothesis here is 1939 were to turn up to me and say, sit down, look at Soviets, where would you take them from a design perspective? I want to go back to Mama. I want to go back to the heart of what started Soviets. And this is that. This is the big heart, kind of the big thrumming heart card behind Soviets in theory, or should be. And this should encourage us to be throwing units at risk. Neil making an interesting point. Throwing units at risk. What about artillery that do more damage if you push them into the front line? That's a very interesting design space. It absolutely would. I could quote a number of battles, as I'm sure you could, where advanced artillery was not an unheard of thing. Especially what would be interesting to me, and I'm spitballing here, it is what I am about to talk about is not balanced, to be clear, because it's just coming off the top of my head. But a piece of Soviet artillery that's covert, concealed battery being the idea behind it. You deploy it as a covert unit, put it into the front line. If it pops in the front line, you could pop it in the rear line as an indifferent piece of artillery, but if you can pop it in the front line, that it would gain a bonus. And again, it goes to actually trying to make the Soviets do something with covert. Another idea I had about making the Soviets able to make some use of the covert mechanic, and it's one that would be very, very hard to implement because of the chosen wording for covert, is giving the Soviets a way of getting covert units to move without op cost. Whether that be through some form of order or unit that you deploy, and of course the problem with this is the wording, because the covert wording means that it can't be targeted by orders or unit effects, even your own. Yeah, basically Neil is spot on. This is the Dornier but for covert, something similar. Yeah, the idea that you can get a sneak, a check, an advantage on the downside, give the Soviets a unique accelerant for covert, whether that is, as I say previously, some form of timer acceleration as part of a research style order, or whether that's a way to cheat covert units into the front line. Reveal if this unit's in the front line, retreat it and give it fury. You do something similar, but I think it would have to be worded to only trigger if your opponent attacked you, otherwise I think it would be too strong. But I think if it was worded so that if your opponent attacks you, if it's revealed on your opponent, so like if this unit is revealed on your opponent's turn, retreat it and give it fury. Or a buff. Another possibility. Yeah, I get exactly where you're going, Ketchbat, which is to create a piece of like concealed artillery that has some impact. It's another direction of travel that you could go in that would be design space that would help and a kind of extant archetype. Like the one thing, of course, the continuing kind of elephant in the room when it comes to covert is that covert is just fundamentally weak to artillery and bombers. And bombers in particular are not exactly uncommon. But I would like to see it explored as an idea. Okay, similar to not no surrender, similar to no retreat, but as a global buff, I assume is what you're talking about. Yep, some form of NKVD style methodology whereby if this unit, as long as this unit is on the board, your units cannot retreat or be suppressed. It's a possibility. That would be interesting. Possibly very strong, but interesting. And obviously, through all of this, you've kind of got to look at this and see, would it fit in with different stuff like this? This is like one of my not one step back. Yes, it does indeed. The poster probably finds itself too. The card art wouldn't be difficult. Yeah, it would help keep Soviets from being driven back, and could do so in a more global way. I mean, again, and it would create a unit that is very, very high priority target for your opponent, which also is interesting. It's not like we haven't seen those already in other formats. Pathfinders, hello. It's like the anti-Pathfinders. 115th separate. This is like one of my favourite cards that I just wish was better. Because I love this idea. I love the idea that this just gets better and better. But it needs support to be able to get better. And I think decoys are good. I like the combination of separate with the ambush. The naval brigade, there it is. Like which one of these are you going to flip? That was interesting to me. I think that has the potential to make Soviet covert interesting, because in that Soviet covert pool you've got two very specific things. I think that's interesting. I think it fits what clearly is in 1939's heads at the minute, which is that they want to do something with covert. And I think if you want to do that, I think it's a shame. And I will say this. I can say this. This is my stream. I can speak my mind. I am actually sad that covert was as split as it was between the Soviet and US. I kind of would have liked them not to have bothered with the US. They were getting retribution and some extra ramp tools, and they're already in a good position anyway. Would have been nice to actually see some of the ideas that were used in the US pointed in a more Soviet direction. And yes, I know you can put the two together, but wouldn't it be nice if the Soviets, as I said earlier, had their own spine? Like their thing. And this is, for me, the heart of what the design question has to be. So returns units to covert, you'd need to shuffle them around. I think it'd be hard to implement. It's an interesting idea. See, I'm not convinced that US does only have ramp, because now that we've seen the adjustment to the big three, I think US mid-range frontline is probably going to be back and being played quite a lot, because mid-range just became a lot more attractive. Ketchup up, I fully agree. Like, there needs to be an early game, which is where I talk about acceleration. US-Japan aggro. Interesting. Your deck, by the way, BVG, is the reason I'm at Field Marshal. And I appreciate that hugely. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of with the idea that what would be interesting with Soviets is to lean into, when this unit is destroyed, something good happens to you. Note, very specifically, and this is the thing, not the Japan equivalent, which is when this unit is destroyed, bad things happen to your opponent, but when this unit is destroyed, good things happen to you, a la the whole point of the propaganda mill that drove the war. Let's say you can come up with new units for USSR as much as you like, but this will not change the overall picture that this nation has. No, I mean, I'm not here to suggest that there's an instant fix, but I got asked the question and sat down specifically to give people what would happen if someone said to me, sit down, break it down the way you would in any other design project, and then where would you go from there? Now, obviously, I'm not going to spend 30 plus hours unpaid breaking it down, doing spreadsheets, coming up with concept designs, researching concept art, and then making a presentation, because 1939 aren't paying me to do that. But this is a fun exercise to me, which is letting you see, to a degree, what it looks like in a design room when you're breaking something down. If I was breaking down the Soviets, the first thing I do is look at the heart of what Soviets have had previously, what looks like their intent, and as I say, I think an inversion of the Japan destruction mechanic, the idea that the more your own units are destroyed, the greater your zeal for your other. It has a name for a mechanic, by the way, zeal. I should copyright that, or at least put a tag on it somewhere. But the idea that, like, why not? Let's go off the top of the head. What about a mechanic? Zeal. A keyword. Zeal. So any unit with zeal has, when an allied unit, friendly unit is destroyed, this unit gets +1 attack. Totally unbalanced, by the way, obviously. You'd have to do a huge amount of work with it, but you can instantaneously come up with an idea that drives forward a mechanic. And that would then create the idea, and then suddenly that feeds into the 0-4. So the unit dies, you get 2 HQ defense, and any of your Zeal units suddenly become better at attacking. So the more your opponent breaks you down, the harder you hit back. That feels kind of Soviet, right? Add that to something like, there you go, Ketchup. Yep. I like the idea of BVG's spot on. I think we do. Like, the top end has been broken down, which is why earlier on I liked the idea of, like, earlier on talking about a Soviet order similar to Blitz Doctrine that makes your units either resistant to or immune to suppress and retreat. That feels very Soviet. Or as Grumpy Neil's suggestion I liked a lot, an NKVD style. Unless they've managed to navigate incredibly difficult legal restrictions in a way that seems unlikely with the Chinese government, I don't think we'll ever see China as a nation in the game. I think, given the size of the Chinese player base and the restrictions that the Chinese government have on the way anything related to China is represented, would make that incredibly hard to do without it being overly controlled. That's just me, and maybe 1939 have solved the problem with their legal department, but I wouldn't want to dig into that hole. Yeah. Deployment or elite order that gives no retreat. That we were talking about that earlier. The two that we kind of brainstormed earlier was a HQ order that means units you deploy gain effectively no retreat, and a unit which is, while this unit is on the board, your units can't retreat, or perhaps can't retreat and are immune to suppress. I think that is a very interesting direction to go in, because again, it links back into it. I'm obviously going to be a fan of my own thought about the idea of some form of zeal or propaganda mechanic whereby your units get better or at least more dangerous the more of your units are destroyed. Because that feels like the way the Soviet engine worked. These are ideas that could build a spine, an archetype within Soviet itself that is critically, as I mentioned earlier in the stream, not related to what ally you pick. BVG's very correct. Blitz Doctrine's great. Let's take a look at the Beriev. Yeah. Yeah, so Beriev, I still have not been able to get the maths to stack up on this. And it hurts my head. Units cost 2 less to deploy. When you deploy unit, retreat this unit. So I pay 3. Yeah, covert units you control have blitz as a temporary effect, another thing. Is stacking the value, like, it costs me 3 to deploy this. Then I deploy a unit that costs 2 for free. Then this goes back to hand and I have to pay 3 to deploy it again, so I've paid 3 for a 2 cost unit. Because this doesn't have blitz, it can't do anything. How does this pay for itself? Yeah, that's chaotic where it is. It's like you need to deploy it at 3 to get a 6k unit. You can get a unit ahead of the curve. But that's the thing. The maths is slow, basically, is my issue with Beriev. I like the concept a lot, but the maths is slow for me. Personal thing, but I think in any kind of aggro-focused meta, which Cards appears to very naturally fall into, for this to pay for itself, it needs to deploy something big at a decent discount multiple times. But I think a similar idea. I do like the idea of something that allows your covert units to have blitz or somehow to sneak forward. I think that's an interesting thought, whether it be the Beriev or something different. But I do agree it would be something that would be, again, interesting with anything that prevents it. Yeah, chaotic. The math stacks up at that point. You're getting 2 deuce uses, but then you've got the delay on the turn that it can actually function, which I don't have anything against. It's just it's never this the functionality of this unit has never appealed to me. I just don't. It doesn't strike me as efficient enough to be worth focusing on. But that's just me. I'm sure you can make good use of it. I just haven't managed to do it yet. But yeah, I think part of what the focus here that we seem to be drifting towards, which is nice, is to understand that the focus needs to be that the Soviets need a way to gain some form of ground-based advantage. Like I say, I love the idea of a covert artillery. I quite like the earlier suggestion of a covert artillery, which, if it's revealed on your opponent's turn, automatically retreats and gets a bonus. That's also interesting to me, because, again, it makes the gamble. I like the idea of the gamble on covert, but, of course, you've got to be able to get covert out fast enough, and the nation that got the card to accelerate that... Yura's the one that was +3 3 attack for the turn and basically overkill, so excess damage goes to HQ, or something similar, correct? Someone tell me if I'm wrong. Can always go look it up, I suppose. Yeah. That something similar to that wouldn't be like seeing basically a trample mechanic. Yeah, plus hey, I remembered a card. In effect, yeah, I mean something like that, like any kind of overrun like that is interesting to look at. The one thing that would be interesting to me, and I'm on spitballing again, would be a version of that card that is much stronger, way more expensive, but gets cheaper every time a unit is destroyed while it's in your hand. Just, again, back to that feeling of Soviet accelerant propaganda. Just random thought processes. Get bonuses again. The idea being bonuses, especially because then it procs nicely in combos with the existence of the 0-4 elite. So every time a unit's dying, you're gaining HQ defense, and this order is getting cheaper, which would then have a huge fit. Had the suppression of Soviet walls appeared for 0 credits or 3 credits? I assume by which you mean the existence of duress and the M10. God decks took a hit from the existence of suppress, absolutely, but then God decks weren't worryingly actually going to be that strong to start with. There are some interesting cards in there to try and benefit from God, but they usually go Brit. Something similar. I'd have to look at stats and maths to see where it would land on the actual curve, but yes, the idea of counteracting units that become cheaper when your units are destroyed, I think is an interesting way of doing it, because it makes the Soviet deck play into value. I think any unit that did that would need Blitz, which means that you'd have to be more careful with its stats. The idea being that at a certain point, after you've battered the Soviets enough, they suddenly pop out a counterattack with units that are much cheaper. And you might have to reduce it to a minimum of X or something similar, because obviously 0 cost units would be an interesting thought. You could bring the, but I mean, again, as long as it's got an op cost on it, then you have the op cost to operate it. Like counteractive tanks would be an interesting perspective. As I say, I like the idea of going in the direction of the bigger a kick you take, the harder you hit back. And I think it is doable. There are mechanics that could be used. So yeah, I mean, there's a line. Something similar. I'm not going to get to actual balance, because I don't get anywhere near the maths of balancing a card until I've actually seen or anything in design until I've seen the actual core concepts. But I love the idea of anything like orders, units, things that reduce cost while in hand for your units being destroyed. Or as I say, that a mechanic on the board that is every time it's specific units that get more dangerous when other units are destroyed. which makes your opponent have to think about the order in which they take things on. Imagine a unit that has the Zeal mechanic I talked about earlier, so it gets +1 attack every time one of your units is destroyed, sat next to a unit with a guard, or you're making the choice between that or a unit with ambush. Give the unit itself ambush. There are different ways that you can do this. Obviously, cost would be a factor in this, but ways to make the decision of, is trading in a specific order more beneficial for you, and is the loss that you would take in that case going to pay off, or is there going to be a negative consequence for it because of something else? And again, you've got the no retreat. I mean, genuinely, what's interesting about this is that we've got in just an hour and a half, we've thrown together a bunch of interesting ideas. You can, yes, and focused on attack, not defense, in answer to Ketchupap's point. The idea behind Zeal would be a buff that is similar to Mobilize, but triggered by things being destroyed. So it's proactive rather than passive, and only makes you angrier. It doesn't make you last any longer. It just means that you hit harder. Which would mean that you'd have to be careful about mass board clears if you miss a unit that has Zeal at the end of it. I've posited both, but I think +1 attack is more thematic. I think just straight +1 attack is more thematic, and easier to balance. It literally just the idea that every time, like any unit that has the Zeal keyword gains +1 attack every time a friendly unit is destroyed. The more you pop things, the harder you get smacked back in the face. Cooler, yes, but probably would mean that you would have to have every unit that had that mechanic have a minimum cost of 5 or 6 credits, because it's too powerful. If it could trigger early, then it would be too strong, as we have seen with self-credit denial and needing to be very careful about where the buffs come from, considering how easy it is for units to be destroyed. That's an interesting direction to go in. Might need to modulate the stats a little, but I see where you're coming from. The idea that you put a piece of infantry down that's completely and utterly useless until such time. It would be like a reserves unit. It would be some form of Neil. If Neil is still around, he will probably have better ideas of the names of the various reserve units that were used. But the idea of a reserves unit, which is basically a non-factor until enough of your units have died. I like that as an idea. Again, that's a concept that I like because it has a slow roll to it, but you can accelerate it by being aggressive. Yes, absolutely. I'm not, in no way am I suggesting that any of these are finished design ideas. They're not. They'd have to go through. The issue with Zeal would be that it would be if you've got any way of being able to generate too many units too cheaply. It does go in the direction of promoting Swarm, which is why it would have to be a very limited mechanic on only a handful of potential units that are easier. Spearhead. Destroy friendly adjacent units. Yeah. I mean, again, A spearhead, destroy a friendly unit and adjacent units. Your units get. Yeah, I mean, again, it's the similar idea. Like, again, it's not. In no way am I. There are many, many hours of testing that would need to be done to make anything like this work. But 100%, there are ideas here that I think are worth exploring, and I think these are the ones that I would want to see much more consistently considered. Like, if I was filing a report at the end of design, something like that. Board state effect. The next 2 turns units cannot be suppressed or something. That would also be neat. Multi-turn effects is something that's very cool to have. Love that. Love it. Love it as an idea. Love the idea of short effects that have limited durations but are very potent. Hell, you could do that with okay, so bear with me. I'm off on a tangent again now because BVG's got me started. An order that is given something like propaganda or propaganda push or something similar that gives for the next X turns, anytime one of your units is destroyed, the units that are currently on the board get +1/+1. So it's a limited duration of the more units hit, the heavier, but it's a short snowball. Again, I have no idea whether it would need to be reduced to just an attack bonus or something similar. I don't know, but I like the idea of a multi-turn effect. This will mainly come from just having more proactive aims. Research is the best recent example. Yep. I think there are signs actually. What the buff that I mean, I like it. I love it. I love the idea that we have so many. Yeah, I don't see any reason that couldn't be used as a really interesting Soviet mechanic. I like the idea that it could proc as an order that would give support to things like Spearhead and the Engineers Battalion, so that every time a unit is dying, it's proccing a thing, and it fixes the concern that was expressed earlier, which I do get, which is that if it was a constant effect, that over spamming light infantry could make it ridiculous, and we could end up in a similar position to where we did with SKD. So why not have it be temporary effects for next 2 turns or whatever? Your units get +1/+1 every time one of your units is destroyed. Stuff like this makes you have to think about timing and tempo and positioning. Gives more advantage to Soviets being able to keep units alive for a period. I mean, as wild as that is, and I can't remember the name of the game, there was a card game that I played a ways back, a physical card game, which had a very similar card. And it saw a lot of play, because the card basically said, win the game in the next, I think it was 5 turns, or you lose. But for those next 5 turns, you have a fundamental buff that if your opponent can survive it, they've won, but if they can't, you win. I don't know that would feel good in cards or any digital game, because that can just feels bad to lose against. I personally like it. I enjoyed that game. I can't remember what it was called. I'm going to have to do some research on that. But again, we're hitting ideas Sea Catch perhaps often I've got people started on the idea of this zeal mechanic. Again, as long as it's limited like anything else, I think there are ways to do this, and I think these are the sort of things that genuinely I would suggest. So the question, I suppose the hypothesis that was mostly asked in my Discord is, what would I suggest as a way to fix Soviets? And the short answer is literally this: brainstorming a bunch of ideas that feel thematic and strong, and picking a couple of them and just committing to going hard on them. Because that's what Soviets need. A lift, a push. And again, I'm going to go back to, I'm using an Apple pencil. Spine. They need a core, a feeling, or more than one. I know people loved T-34. I didn't get a chance to play enough of it to know whether I like it or not. But again, it's like, oh, which one's Ural Factories? Include reserved cards, Ural Factories. Huh. Something that it might need a rework, but something like that. I think that's interesting. Oh, apparently it's going to thunder tomorrow. Like, genuinely, I wouldn't necessarily mind seeing something like this come back. Because it's, again, it's encouraging buffs from the destruction of your units. And I'm gonna go back to it again because I keep doing it and I'm not doing it. I've not gone mad. If you're going to do this, start here. Go to this. Yes, the Met Office has issued a severe yellow warning for thunderstorms tomorrow, which I just got in my area. Go back to the heart of it. Roll on back to the center point and find your center and what Soviet ones or just in general? Let's pull up the pool. Plank. Revert. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. So a mighty 5. Or if we include everybody, 8, 11. Technically about 12 hours, but yeah. No, we only get warned about them if they go over a certain point. Like, we get quite a few thunderstorms in the UK, but not severe ones enough for anyone to care about. But we don't see we don't get thunderstorms the way that you get thunderstorms in the US. I've been in some very impressive, like, US and European thunderstorms, and they are cool. Yeah, I'd probably missed a couple of things off this list. They don't know why. But yeah, it was. The answer is what you would expect. Which is that we got the beginning of something that could then become something much more interesting. Which is something that I'd like to see grow. Thanks, Fun Police. Yeah, so 11 units and then 3 to 4 support cards, which is about what you'd expect. Enough to begin. By the way, Fun Police, I really enjoyed your video on the balance patch. It's nice to see more content creators doing stuff like that and breaking it down. I had quite a laugh with J King last night as the two of us messaged, going, "Look at the two of us rushing out a video at the same time." Yeah, so honestly, Fun Police, if you get a chance to go back and watch some of my streams, I might be the exception in this list. I've really enjoyed the covert mechanic in Soviets, even if it has been very, very hard to get to actually do anything that I want it to, because I still believe it needs a shunt, a push. But I really enjoy doing some pretty interesting things with it, and I like the mechanics. And I think exploring new mechanics is just cool. And obviously, there's one mechanic that I've enjoyed more than others in this, and one mechanic that I've liked a lot less than others in the new mechanics. But no, fundamentally, I think the solution, I suppose, there should be some kind of conclusion to this rambling stream. I can't believe I've been talking for nearly 2 hours, nor can I believe that you guys have hung out with me listening to me ramble on for 2 hours. I think it's really cool. The conclusion of this is, what would I do if someone from 1939 said, take a look at the Soviets, break them down, come back with suggestions? The suggestions I'd be coming back with are, let's find a way to focus on gaining advantage from loss. Let's look at the engineer regiment as a guiding point. The idea that our units dying is getting something. Let's also take a look at covert and see if there's a way that can make covert a Soviet thing that they do better than anyone else. And if we can, let's try and build on that by giving them some ways to get past some of the downsides. So we talked about the zeal mechanic, the idea that there would be some method, whether it be an order that temporarily gives your units the effect, or whether certain units just have it inherently, whether that be bigger late units that gain more benefits, or whether it's something that is a unit, as was posited earlier, that is basically next to a non-entity until it's had a chance to gain benefits from units being destroyed. Then take a look at the idea that then gives the feel that Soviets can do it. The other suggestion, of course, being similar ideas, the ways to temporarily, or whether that be as long as a unit is on the board, your units can't retreat or be suppressed, or because an order that temporarily does it. It's hard to really judge how people receive things until they're actually played with them. Like, people wanted more board interactions, covert very much first, and the board being hard to deal with. I like that as it's good summary, and it's definitely the intention. Yeah, mechanics wise, I think one of the limitations on the mechanics is that covert is self-limiting. So, in answer to Cola's comment on testing, Fun Police / anyone else who's in internal testing, because I'm not currently and therefore have not had a chance to see what the NDA is unless they accept me for internal testing. I don't know what you're limited on saying, but my understanding is that internal testing for 1939 is by necessity both short and in a very compact group of players. And that makes some things much harder to actually judge. So for me, for a game with the player base that we're talking about, you would be if you had infinite money, i.e., your Wizards of the Coast and have Hasbro support, you are pre-testing the next expansion 3 to 4 months in advance over at least 1,000 playtesters with at least 2 or 3 feedback cycles every month and development meetings. I don't think 1939 are capable of doing that. I don't think they have the money to do it. And that is let's take a look. God's sake. Sorry, Fun Police. There you go. Yeah, so, and this is the hardest part of design, is the need to release overtuned for things that impact existing meta versus the need to be very sparing with how strong you make a completely new thing into a game, because if the new thing is too strong, it tends to create incredibly intense negative reactions. And if you don't overtune something that's adding to an existing archetype, no one bothers. And that's not easy. In the Discord, people put emoticons about their attitude in units with covert. Clue to me. So it's interesting, and I think part of the challenge with this is I don't know the answer to what percentage of the full Cards player base is represented on Discord, but I suspect it's quite small. At least actively represented on Discord. There are a lot of voices, mine included, that are quite loud and constant. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can speak for everyone else. I mean, I go out of my way to attempt to, like I did at the beginning of this stream, advocate that I'm starting from the point of view of a new player, and that will always be my intent. Yeah, I would agree with that. Fun Police. If anyone wants to go back and watch me playing around with Covert with Soviet US over the last 1 or 2 Tuesday streams, that deck's not terrible. I will die on that hill. That deck is not terrible. You can win on it, especially if you pepper the deck with enough frontline tools. I was making use of all things, 2 cost infantry and Soviet. This was a fundamental thing for me that I suddenly realised this is really, really good if I'm trying to get anything out of Covert, because this gives me a turn 2 drop that I can get into the front line to at least give me a chance of being able to get my Covert units into the front line. It's decent. It's just not strong. It's it's not going to make its way to competitive play. Also, because it's far too counterable by a good competitive player. A good competitive players will very quickly realise that they just need to include bombers and artillery. And that blunts covert. Whereas a covert player will ideally play removal in their deck to get rid of bombers and artillery as targets of priority. Which is another thing that would be interesting to see more tools for that sort of thing. Turmoil was a good start, but I think Turmoil could do with being cheaper. Where's Turmoil gone? I'm going to talk about Turmoil now because this is something I have an opinion on. Turmoil's 4 cost, right? He said, possibly. And then my internet stopped working. There we go. I don't want you. Did I get Turmoil wrong? Turmoil 3 cost? Forever wandering through. Is Turmoil 3? No, Turmoil's 2. This I would like to see used more. It is 2k. I think it needs to either be stronger or cheaper. But I like this as an idea because it combos very nicely with things like Sickle and various other Soviet damaging tools. I like that. Mechanics don't have to always be their own tier 1 deck is the thing. We've seen some decks come around these certain high-powered versions of Veteran Salvage. Yep. So again, it depends on your expectation for the meta and your level of play. Like, if BVG is still hanging around in chat, if you're focused on climbing on ladder, most of the larger meta of the game, which is to say the meta in the ranks at the bottom end of Field Marshal and from 6 up, is totally irrelevant. Because you're focusing on competitive level decks, which are always going to look different. Now, that's not to say that there's a differentiation in thought. You need to look at both sides of it. Covert, I think, is an interesting enough mechanic that, with a bit more support and time to bed in, might actually become more adopted. I think it's interesting that of the 2 mechanics, Retribution was the one that was more leapt upon by the general populace. I think part of that is that many of them may be familiar with the Hearthstone, and that's in and of itself interesting. Ketchup App, if you catch me on Discord or somewhere else, send me some thoughts. I love the fact that people are inspired by the thought, and this is like what Fun Police is saying. I totally get, which is that there has to be a certain amount of the wild westier parts in the lower ranks, because not everybody wants to watch me spew on for 40 odd minutes to an hour to build their first starter decks unless they've got a specific goal in mind, or someone similar to me. And that's a thing in and of itself. Develop's definitely been a widely enjoyed mechanic. Yeah, despite the fact that I have issues, they are very specific ones. Develop as a mechanic, I actually think is kind of cool. I really enjoy seeing it used. I just think there were a couple of very, very egregious choices made. I think one has been fixed-ish, although I still live on the hill that it doesn't need fixing, it just needs obliterating. Sorry, I it's a personal thing, but at the same time, yeah, I saw covert operations. Two big focuses being covert and develop. I think they were, when I first saw the releases, those were the two things that were a big part of what was in there. And then I think there were a couple of specific archetype increases, like self-credit denial, but self-credit denial was strongly enabled, frankly, by a develop card, air, land, and sea. And obviously retribution, which is just a US specific instance of develop. Um, and that's I like retribution as an idea for the US. I still think is really cool. I just like to see the pool changed. Um, but that's right now we'll sit and see how the fix sits, but that's a different video. But yeah, I think I would like to see some more Soviet developed ideas, and genuinely, I think there are some good ones here, and I think I would be happy to talk many of them through in a great deal more detail if I had the time to put into it. But again, bluntly, uh, I mean, this patch, Fun Police, I did not expect Soviets. I was pleasantly surprised to see the two changes that Soviets did get, because this patch was always going to have to be focused on the top three and the elephant in the room. Because that was what the issue was. And I think it's done. I think the touch is good enough that it's probably done that. I think the gap probably has narrowed. I think it's certainly at the point now where I would expect to see mid-range decks doing, like classic mid-range decks, doing fairly well. Hey, Enrico. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't playable Soviet decks. I think one of the things that I essentially wanted to focus on in this was Soviets in isolation, like the core of the nation and its identity. Um, and I think anybody who goes through this will find that I have definitely, like, I mean, that has been my intent from the beginning down here, and at some point I might narrow all of this down into an actual video where I talk about some of the stuff that we came up with here. Yeah, gotcha. I'll catch them up later. Um, I honestly believe that the Soviet destruction part of that, the idea of really focusing hard on the idea that your units dying gives you advantage, is one of the most cool things you could do with Soviets. Um, but again, I mean, I'm not here to make full design submissions because that costs money. Um, that's the reality of the world. But I love the idea that we could go in that direction, and I think it would be really cool. Also, this, I mean, let me know via Discord and various other things as well if people have enjoyed this. But I mean, there's enough interaction in chat with people that, frankly, clearly, some of you guys have really enjoyed just sitting with me and talking through this. I may do some more streams like this talking about design and concept ideas, because it's fun for me, because this is, as a number of people will tell you, how my brain works. This is where I live. But for now, I'm probably going to wrap up. I think it's been a pretty cool stream. You guys have been really chill in chat. I think we've cooked up some interesting ideas. And I've had a blast. It's been very relaxing. Thank you, Ketchpap. I will probably do more of these if people enjoy these, because this is different. Because this is interaction. This is not just me playing a game on the stream. Um, Let me see what's going on in my world, Collar, because I honestly don't know whether I have time or not. Because I have a wife and life. I would like to do more of this. I think it's been fun, and fun is cool. But yeah, it's been a blast, and thank you all for being here and chilling out. Let me just check whether anyone else is streaming, which I always do, because no, I know I totally understand your desire to try. The like getting on Discord for any length of time for me at the minute is a nightmare. Like, mostly when I'm answering stuff on Discord, I'm on my phone. But I have had an absolute blast doing this, and thank you all for being friendly and understanding, and above all, I really want to say thank you all for being really well behaved in chat. When talking about stuff like this, there is always the chance that people are going to take people's thoughts the wrong way or get chippy with other people, and you guys haven't, and that I love that part of this community. Thank you, Fun Police, by the way, for jumping on as well, because it's pretty cool to catch you, and I look forward to hopefully seeing more content from you. I shall be giving you a follow on YouTube in the near future. As ever, take care of yourselves, be good human beings, and I'll catch you next time, whenever that happens to be.